Okay, you guys know what dividends are, right? That's where you get money from a stock. And you can get them from preferred stock or common stock, but most of what we'll look at will be looking at common stock. So we're going to look first at factors that affect dividend policy. You know, some companies pay dividends regularly, and some companies don't pay any dividends at all. And so what are some factors that affect the decision to pay dividends or not? One of those is legal rules. There are some legal requirements out there that govern dividend payments. One of those legal rules is capital impairment restriction. Capital impairment restriction. That means you cannot pay out equity in dividends. So if you've got stock investors putting in $100 million into a firm, company makes money over the course of a few years, you know, making profit, whatever, they can pay dividends out of their retained earnings. That is the sum of all their net profits and net losses before. But they can't pay out dividends out of that $100 million that was initially invested. Follow that?
Sorry, can you say the name of it one more time?
I'll do the best that I can. Yes, we're going to be giving you some legal restrictions, okay? There are factors that affect dividend policy, and I'll have 7 total. The first one is legal rules, and I have 3 of those rules. Okay, so this is like ABC under number 1. So A under number 1 is capital impairment restrictions. The government says you cannot pay out paid-in capital. So whatever someone's invested in a firm cannot be paid out in dividends.
Say that one more time, that last part.
I'll do my best. A company cannot pay out what investors have invested in the firm in dividends. So whatever they invested in the company. Now this is not you buying a stock on the stock market and someone else selling it. Okay, the firm gets no money from that. You understand? Remember we talked about the primary and secondary markets in our first test? And the primary market is the only time the firm gets money. So whatever money they get when they first sell the stock, that money that they get, they cannot pay out in dividends. That's considered capital, if you will. And they cannot give it out.
So can I ask, just to clarify that point?
You can ask anything you want.
So if I pay $10,000 to get, $10,000 to get into this company,
Yeah.
and they can't pay me back dividends to equal that $10,000 amount, they can only pay me dividends of whatever the company made and are paying out to everybody based on their shares. Is that the point?
Not quite, almost.
Okay.
If you were the initial investor with the company,
Mhm.
and you were the first person to buy their stock, the stock that you had, the $10,000 worth, and you gave that to the company, that would be true. They could not pay out that particular money. Now, if they earn over the course of time, they earned per share for your investment, however much you shares you. Let's say you had 1 share to make it easy, okay?
Okay.
And so if they had enough income to where they could give out enough money from their earnings, their incomes added together, to pay you $10,000, they can do that.
Sure.
$20,000, that's fine. But they can't pay you back as in dividends that original $10,000 they received.
So it always comes from
That-
earnings?
It does.
Okay.
Dividends come from earnings,
Okay.
cannot come from the capital.
That's the point. Okay, I got you.
The capital is restricted, it's called a capital impairment. It means you cannot be restricted, you cannot impair to the capital. The B part of legal rules is insolvency. It's called the insolvency rule. Cannot pay dividends if you're insolvent. So what is, beg your pardon?
How could you?
You can. You just should. You can, but legally you cannot. Now, all that insolvency means is that, if you remember this from your accounting probably, you had current liabilities and, total liabilities and total assets, right? Well, if your total liabilities exceed your total assets, all right? Now you remember the equation, right? I've got total assets, I've got total liabilities, and total liabilities does not quite equal my total assets. What's the difference between the two?
Equity.
Yes, my equity. That's right, my net worth, whatever you want to call it. That's right, okay? So this says that you're upside down in your home. This says that your debt is bigger than your equity in your home, than the value of your home, total assets. That's what that says. So if you've got a house that's worth $100,000 and you owe 120, you're upside down in the home. You follow me? That's what they're saying is happening here. The total assets is smaller than your total debt. That makes your equity, your net worth, a negative number effectively. It means you're insolvent. And when you're insolvent, you cannot pay dividends out. Because you can understand why. You have bondholders who say, you owe us $120,000. What are you doing giving away money to your owners? Owners shouldn't be getting money. That's our money. Even if you gave us all your money, you can't pay the 120, you can pay 100 of it. That's the reason the rule exists there. You can't pay dividends if you're insolvent. C, or the third thing under legal rules, is the undue retention of retained earnings. This is a not often used rule except for mostly for small businesses. But you cannot, the IRS will not let you store retained earnings indefinitely. The second factor, so the first one's legal rules. The second factor is the funding needs of the firm. You know, if the firm's looking at expanding soon, you know, like going overseas or picking a new territory or building a new plant, whatever it might be, do you think that affects their dividend decision, whether they pay dividends or not? You bet it does, yeah. So they've got these retained earnings built up maybe, and they're thinking, well, we're gonna need to go do this project, and if I pay out these dividends, if I pay out extra dividends, if I increase dividends, I have to borrow more money to go do the project. Well, why should I want to borrow money? I've already got cash for free, if you will. And so the funding needs of the firm definitely affects their dividend decision. The third factor that affects the dividend decision is liquidity. What do you suppose paying dividends does to a firm's liquidity? Does it make them more liquid or less liquid? Absolutely, you bet. So you're paying out cash, for crying out loud. So yeah, it's gonna make you less liquid. The fourth factor is a firm's ability to borrow. Now, if a firm has a high ability to borrow compared to a low ability to borrow, okay, so I think I've got a high line of credit or a low line of credit. You can think of it that way. Which one of those you think, how would being one or the other affect whether you pay dividends or not?
If you have a low line of credit, you're not going to pay the dividends.
That's exactly right. If I have a low line of credit, if I have a low ability to borrow, I'm not very likely to pay dividends. That's exactly right. And I'm more likely to pay dividends if I have access to borrowing money. Sure. Absolutely. So your ability to borrow affects dividend policy. The fifth issue is called restrictive covenants. And what happens there is where dividend limits are set by creditors. You guys ever heard of restricted covenants before? It's usually in bonds, or sometimes you borrow from a bank. My most experience has been, you borrow money from a bank and they'll say, okay, we'll loan you money, but they'll put a restricted covenant in the loan that says you have to keep so much money in their bank as a deposit. That's the most common thing you'll see. They'll say, all right, you're going to borrow $100 million, you've got to keep, $1 million in the bank all the time, in our bank all the time. So you'll see that sometimes. But here, sometimes they'll say you guys remember the current ratio, current assets compared to current liabilities?
Yeah.
They'll say you have to keep that some number too, to keep your liquidity stable. So they'll have that as a restricted covenant sometimes. And they also here may also limit dividends for a company. Okay, fine, we'll loan you money, but we're not going to loan you money so you can take that money and give it to your owners. The sixth item is a control factor for management. Control factor for management. Which one do you think would give the management more control of the firm? If they're paying out dividends and have less cash on hand, or if they're not paying dividends and have more cash on hand? Which one does the management prefer, do you think?
Cash.
They prefer to have the cash on hand.
Not paying out.
You know, if I'm giving cash out, then everything that I do, everything else will cost them. Borrow more money, which has me having more monitoring by someone. I've got more people over my shoulder wondering what I'm doing, or I've got to apply for the loan and show my books. And so everything else held constant, management's preference for control would affect dividend policy as well. So the more dividends they pay out, the less control management might have over decisions that are made. And the last factor that can affect dividends is dividend stability. And basically, that says that once a firm announces a dividend amount, it's usually some amount per share. If they reduce that in the future, that's considered bad news. I mean, you're saying you're going to give this much in dividend. Typically, investors expect you to maintain that dividend. You say we're going to give 25 cents a share a year, they expect to have that every year. And if you change that, they think you're telling them something, okay? And if you increase your dividends, they think you're telling them you can afford to give dividends. And if you reduce the dividends, they're thinking you can't afford to give dividends. And so you're giving them bad news. And so it's more than just the money they get or don't get. It's also the information you're giving as well. And so dividend stability is important to the investors and to firms who have dividend policy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The next thing I want to share with you is a concept that was given by Modigliani and Miller. Modigliani and Miller. They are two individuals who did a study together. In fact, they've done several studies together. But Modigliani and Miller, their article, first article was 1958, followed one in 1963. That was a long time ago. Most of you were born. But these guys argued that dividend policy is irrelevant. Dividends are irrelevant. They say it doesn't matter. You can do whatever you want to as a company and it won't change the value of your company's stock. It won't change how investors see you. And their argument was twofold. The first argument was twofold. The first argument was, if someone prefers to have dividends over not having dividends, and you look at a company that doesn't pay dividends, well, they could buy into the stock in the company that doesn't have dividends, but then they can make their own dividends, their own homemade dividends. So their argument number one as to why dividends don't matter is because investors can create homemade dividends. Let's say I buy into a company and the price has increased over time. That's great, but the company doesn't pay any dividends. They continue to do well. How do I get any money out of them? Well, I just sell a few shares of that company. I sell a few shares and I wind up creating my own dividend. I still wind up with the same total. I can still wind up with the same total amount invested. Let's say that I had $100,000 invested, and my stock that I invested in the firm, $100,000, went to 110. I can sell off 10% of that. I can sell off the 10,000 of it. I still wind up with $100,000 in stock, but I've got $10,000 from selling. I can create my own dividends if I want to, homemade dividends. That was one argument. The second argument is the other way around. Let's say a company does pay dividends and you don't want dividends anymore. You can do the same thing by taking the dividend and reinvesting it back in the company itself.